infrastructure itself in general is experiencing a moment, so to speak, among global urban policymakers. So this has been characterized as an infrastructure push, an infrastructure scramble, or among scholars, an infrastructure turn. And I think one of the reasons why that's happening is, perhaps some of you recognize this, it's the International Guidelines on Urban and Territorial Planning from the UN Habitat. In 2016, UN Habitat established a new urban agenda. So every 20 years that takes place. And in accordance with the new urban agenda, all signatories, so that is basically all countries in the General Assembly, agreed to establish national urban plans using these guidelines. So this is not, in my opinion, driving a re-centralization of urban policy. On the contrary, urban policy was being re-centralized in many countries. Since the 1980s and 90s, there had been a decentralization. That's been reversed very recently. And the new urban agenda simply, formalized that reversal. So now countries must develop new urban plans in accordance with these guidelines, some of which will, of course, be just plans that you put on a shelf to gather dust, but others will have real policy implications. So in the context of that re-centralization of urban policy, I think there's real political will in some places to develop infrastructure, and there's a concerted attempt or effort to mobilize private investment. There is a recognition that state-coordinated investment will not suffice if we just look at the infrastructure deficit that we see in many countries. So I've just pulled a couple of examples. The first one is from the Global Infrastructure Hub that was established in 2014 by the G20. And what it does is it's kind of like matchmaking for infrastructure investments and project managers. You register your project anywhere in the world, and then there are a series of stages from the conceptualization to the kind of design, issuing a tender, getting investment, getting all of the assessments squared away, and so on. And the investors can kind of jump on at any stage. So it's really a matter of just trying to match investors with projects. That hasn't worked as well, I think, as the G20 would have liked. So the World Bank is partnering with the Global Infrastructure Hub, and that's the Global Infrastructure Facility. And what it does is it helps project proponents frame their projects in a standardized way to make them more legible to investors. So I see from the OECD a concerted attempt to figure out ways to channel capital into what might be very risky endeavors. Interestingly, we also see this in East Asia. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has a very similar scheme. And very recently, the largest mortgage broker in Hong Kong has decided to securitize infrastructure investments in a very similar way that subprime mortgages were securitized in the US prior to the 2008 financial crisis. So this is not just the OECD, I think this is global. There's a political will and to invest in infrastructure, also a recognition that the amount of money available coming from the private sector is not enough. So these are institutional mechanisms to channel capital into infrastructure. So what that means for us is that we'll see a lot of investment, or we may see a lot of investment in the three fields that we've gathered here today to talk about. And it also means politically that it could be very top-down, the way that decisions surrounding infrastructure investment are made. They're made certainly at a greater distance from the street than they may have been years ago, or that they would be if they weren't coming from, say, the G20, let alone national governments. So this is something I think that we need to keep in mind, and we spoke a moment ago about where decisions are made, and it may not always be in the liberal democratic context.